All right, guys, we're on the home stretch now when it comes to federal bureaucracy, and honestly, we're on the home stretch now for the entirety of the executive branch, so let's get right to it. Let's start where we left off on the Department of the State. So, the State Department is in charge of making and conducting foreign policy. And the person in charge of the State Department is known as the Secretary of State. Now, as long as you know what foreign policy is, that definition should be pretty straightforward. But never that simple now, is it? So, what is foreign policy? Now, foreign policy is just basically a government strategy in how they're going to deal with other nations. The U.S. foreign policy has been shaped over the years by various events and alliances and wars and all that different stuff. But let me tell you it in terms that you might be able to understand. Imagine it like a football game, like in the NFL, and you're a defensive coordinator for your team, and you're about to face the Baltimore Ravens. Now, if you're facing the Baltimore Ravens, what would you defend? Would you defend the pass or would you defend the rush? If you're not good with football, then you would defend the rush because of Lamar Jackson and Mark Ingram and all those people. But let's say the following week you had to face the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, same question, do you defend the pass or do you defend the run? At that point, the answer would change. You would defend the pass because of Patrick Mahomes. And it's the same thing for foreign policy here in the United States. Depending on the nation, depends on how we game plan for that nation. Sometimes that foreign policy is extremely good, like with the United Kingdom or Israel. Sometimes that foreign policy is not so good. Think of like Russia, think of like Iran. Regardless of how you choose it, foreign policy is simply a game plan for other nations, and that's what the State Department's in charge of. Now, a couple of interesting foreign policies historically, just for your usage. I like the Monroe Doctrine for one. Long story short, for the Monroe Doctrine was it was a policy enacted by James Monroe, the fifth president, that told European countries that you could no longer colonize the Western Hemisphere. And when all those Central and South American countries were starting to have their revolutions and gaining independence, this doctrine was one of the reasons that stayed. Otherwise, Spain or England or France or whoever would have came back and recolonized those colonies. But because of something known as the Monroe Doctrine, which is a form of foreign policy, that changed things. Although, to be fair, the European nations really honestly didn't care because there was another continent right and ready for them to colonize. Which, if you don't know anything about African colonization, yeah, look it up. Another doctrine which was interesting was the Truman Doctrine, and that was a foreign policy that stated that we were going to fight the Soviet expansion no matter where it happened, and ushering in the Cold War, obviously. Even after Truman's presidency, this foreign policy stayed, this doctrine, which also led to consequences. Korea, Vietnam, all those various wars. Now, another thing the State Department is in charge of is ambassadors, and this goes for the ambassadors that we send out as well as the ambassadors we receive. Now, every nation in the world sends out ambassadors. Every nation has that right to send some type of representative to speak on the country's behalf to another foreign country, and the State Department's in charge of the ones we send out, as well as the ambassadors we receive from other nations. They also are in charge of embassies, and an embassy, short summary, is just the headquarters for the U.S. on some foreign soil. If you are in a country, like let's say you go to a country like Turkey, and let's say while you're on your vacation in Turkey, World War III happens and they discontinue all the traveling and there's no flights going in and out, and you're freaking out at that point. Go look for the U.S. Embassy. That's basically U.S. soil. There's people there that'll speak English, and they'll try their best to help you out, even if it means that you stay at that embassy for quite some time. So, the whole point of embassies is for assisting civilians who are in other countries, as well as assisting ambassadors who go to other countries. Now, another thing that the State Department deals with, and this is the last thing we'll talk about for the State Department, is passports and visas. So, if you were curious what department in the executive branch is responsible for making that passport so you could have safe travel between the U.S. and Costa Rica, State Department. And that's it for the State Department. Let's move on to the Treasury Department. And honestly, this should be pretty straightforward, so I'll keep it pretty simple. The Treasury Department deals with money, whether it be producing money, whether it be collecting taxes, whether it be paying the bills of the United States, whether it be supervising the banks, whether it be advising the president on fiscal policy, and a whole lot more, because there's a lot to do when it comes to money. Now, that being said, they are the ones that actually print and mint all the currency, and they also collect all that currency back once they get federal taxes through the IRS. Now, I know what some of you guys might be thinking. If you're thinking money and Treasury Department, you're probably thinking, like, okay, then the Federal Reserve is obviously going to be part of this. Well, actually, no. Like what you might think, because Federal Reserve equals like a big bank, which equals money, and we're talking about a department that deals with money. The Federal Reserve is actually not part of any executive department, including the Department of Treasury. All the Federal Reserve serves as a banker. They're the ones that process transactions for the United States. They send out the payroll checks to all the people who work for the three branches of government, the welfare checks, and a whole lot more. They do work closely with the U.S. to maintain a stable economy. Depending on who you ask, that may be a good thing or a bad thing. I'll just say, spoiler alert, Andrew Jackson would be rolling in his grave. Now, the last department that we're going to talk about in explicit detail is the DOJ, the Department of Justice. They're pretty much the lawyers of the executive branch. They're here to enforce the law as well as defend the interests of the United States when it comes to the law. And the Attorney General is the one who is in charge of all of it. Head Justice of the Department and Chief Law Officer of the federal government, the Attorney General represents the U.S. in any legal matter. If someone was suing the federal government or if there was a legality situation when it came between the branches, Attorney General is your guy. He also serves as the president's lawyer. Now, when you get a little bit older, you're going to want to have an attorney or a lawyer on standby. Now, lawyers and attorneys are a lot more than just if I get thrown into jail scenario. It's more for wise counsel. So, like in the case of the Attorney General, the President of the United States doesn't use it for the in case I get thrown into jail situation. It's more of the I want to talk about whether or not the things I want to do are completely legal or not. Now, we're talking about the DOJ and justice, and you might think of justice with lawyers, and if you're thinking lawyers, you might be thinking of like a judicial branch at that point. So why isn't it part of like the judicial branch? It's just because of the concept of checks and balances. Based on what the Constitution says about the three branches of government, it cannot be part of that branch. It would be really, really weird if the executive branch had somebody working in the judicial branch that they could potentially influence. So that's why they are in the executive branch. Now, the rest of the cabinet, there are a lot of positions in all these departments, but you're going to be finding out more about them later. Stay tuned. But here's a few other positions inside that cabinet that isn't associated with a department of blank or a secretary of blank. And the first is the National Security Council. So, long story short, the National Security Council is there to advise the president on national security and foreign policies when it comes to national security. It's composed of many people. They have their own section of the White House, and they're talking about stuff that are really, really important, but may not necessarily involve the other departments. I don't think the Department of Agriculture needs to really be involved when it comes to national security, unless broccoli takes over. So you have people like the president, vice president, you have the state, defense, and energy departments, you have the attorney general, you have the joint chiefs of staff, and a few more people. Anybody that comes with national security or their title is associated with national security. Now, another person of the president's cabinet is the chief of staff. And this is the highest ranking employee of the White House, as in kind of like the boss of all the people working in the White House that don't go their separate ways and do their own departments and stuff like that. Whether it be something as simple like the press secretary or something more simpler than that, like a custodian. So they manage communication and information between the departments. So, like, I'm talking to Energy Department and Transportation Department, and I'm collaborating with the two. They control access to the Oval Office, who gets in, who gets out. And they also supervise key White House staff, again, like the person who does all the press conferences and all that different stuff. Now, when I was making this PowerPoint for you guys, I just could not honestly be bothered to change all the pictures of all the people who have been fired in the previous year. So, yeah, don't pay attention to this guy. He was fired. Anywho, Next person in the president's cabinet is the director of central intelligence, or the person in charge of the CIA. They are also part of the president's cabinet. If you don't know what the CIA is, I'll tell you more about it a different day. Uh, Mike Pompeo was the guy there, but then he got a promotion, which means he's no longer there. Another person in the president's cabinet was the ambassador to the United Nations. Now, the United Nations is not a country. It's an area where we go and meet with other nations and deliberate and talk about our grievances, vote on things, and try to show a little bit of diplomacy instead of just showing up with like bazookas and stuff like that. So, just like we have an ambassador to foreign nations, we also had an ambassador to the United Nations. It was Nikki Haley, but she resigned, so she's no longer there either. The U.S. Trade Representative, this is someone who's responsible for recommending trade policy with the United States to the president, whether it be exercising tariffs, whether it be lowering taxes, whether it be implying sanctions on a country. There's a lot of different things that the trade representative does. This person is still there, so he gets a smiley face. And the last one we'll be talking about today is the Director of Office of Management and Budget. Long story short, this guy is going to figure out what the president's policies are going to ultimately cost. So if the president has an idea of, like, I don't know, build a wall, the director of the OMB is going to say, okay, it's going to cost this much to do it this way. So you can suggest it to Congress however you want. This guy's also still there. So that is smiley face there. Now, there's a little bit more to the executive branch, which is outside the White House. I'm just going to keep it really short and sweet. We call those independent agencies. And long story short, there are different agencies that exist outside the actual White House, but they are still under the authority of the executive office of the President of the United States, which, long story short, means that they were created by Congress. They technically fall in the executive branch, but they're independent of the president's control, meaning the president doesn't do a whole lot with them, but other than sign bills that fund them, essentially. Example, NASA. Now, the president can do a lot for NASA. He can approve spending bills, he can promote missions, he can even wear the blue uniform if he so chose. However, it might be counterproductive if the president chose his own astronauts, hence the independent agencies. They're under the executive branch, but the president has really little influence over them. FDA is another great example. The FDA is in charge of protecting the health of the public, and when it comes to foods and drugs, might be problematic if the president could choose how much or how little public safety is of importance. ATF is another good example. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And there's a whole lot more. In reality, there's 12 of them, but they're still part of the executive branch, but they're outside of the president's control. They can impose and enforce regulations free of political influence. Now, what is a regulation? Pretty much is how to interpret a law. So, like if Congress made a bill saying save the whales, the EPA would be the ones making regulations, figuring out how we save those whales, and when we save those whales, and why we save those whales. So a law is more of kind of the what. We pass a law and it's like, okay, we need to save the whales. A regulation is more of the how. Now, I know that was a lot, guys, but that's all, folks. We are finito for now with the executive branch. Be on the lookout for a pretty exciting assignment that you'll be doing Thursday and Friday. Stay tuned.